Our next speaker is really going to sort of, I think, lay the groundwork for the whole conference today. John Regenold is the professor of soil science and agroecology at Washington State University. He teaches agroecology there, and he has done as much work as anybody that I know on measuring basically every single kind of outcome with organic farming and with agriculture in general, and comparing the different systems, conventional and alternative systems, particularly organic farming systems. I think another milestone that I would like to add is the paper that John Regenold published in Nature in 2001, Sustainability of 3 Apple Production Systems. It put some of this work that I think a lot of people here do on the map for a very big audience, and it's exciting to have John here today.
Thank you very much. Oh, here they are. Good. Okay. I'm not familiar with this system. I was asked to talk about comparing organic and conventional farming systems and what we can measure, and I've been doing this kind of work since 1985. And actually, I have to give credit to an undergraduate student who was majoring in soil science and came into my office and asked me, I was at that time doing research looking at protection of prime farmland. I'd been at Washington State University for a couple of years, and she wanted to know how you could measure soil properties in the field, but also wanted to know how you could measure microbes in the lab. And I said, well, I can show you the field part, but we'll have to get a microbiologist to do the lab part. And so I went to Lloyd Elliott, who was a microbiologist in our department. He actually worked with USDA, was housed in our department. And Lloyd and I and Yvonne went up to these 2 farms. I'm going to actually, I have a slide of it. And they were side by side. One was organic, one was conventional. And this particular farm was the only organic wheat-producing farm in the Palouse area. And if you don't know about the Palouse area in eastern Washington, it's about 2 million acres in size. And it's the most productive rain-fed wheat-producing area on a per-acre basis in the world. So it's pretty important. It's also one of the more erodible areas. And so we did this study, and I showed her how to do all the field stuff. Lloyd showed her how to do the lab stuff, and we ran the analysis and had all these really dramatic results, differences between the 2 systems, looking at soil quality and soil erosion. And we published the paper in Nature. And if Yvonne Unger would not have come into my office, that wouldn't have happened. And she had a 2.7 GPA. She was a B- student, so bless those B- students, you know. So thank you, Yvonne. Okay. So what I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we can measure. I personally feel you can pretty much measure anything. It's just having the way is there. It's just having the will, and sometimes it's political will to do it. So there are probably more than just 2 metric systems. I kind of consider 2 metric systems to look at. One is where you actually go out and measure sustainability indicators, things like soil quality, crop quality, protein content, vitamin content, crop yield, things like that. Or you can look at ecosystem services. That's real important too. So I'll just give you some examples. And there are many more than what's listed. I mentioned the crop yield and quality, and this also includes animal systems. Of course, there's economics, there's costs, there's gross returns, there's net returns. Soil health, you can look at individual properties, physical, chemical, biological. You can actually take those properties and put them into an index, which we've done. And that's actually thanks to Doug Carlin at Iowa State University, who put together a soil quality index and for grain systems, and we've modified it for orchard systems. You can look at all kinds of environmental quality measurements. You can look at groundwater contamination, movement of nitrate, movement of pesticides in the soil. You can look at soil erosion. You can look at pests and diseases. You can count bugs. And you can also do surveys, and there are other methodologies to measure social parameters, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's also a recent push to look at ecosystem services, and I took this from Jonathan Foley, who's now at Minnesota, and I like this diagram. This was published in Science in 2005, and so you can see a natural ecosystem, intensive cropland, and then cropland with restored ecosystem services, and it shows, using this, the petals of a flower, basically ecosystem services like water flow regulation, carbon sequestration, preserving biodiversity, and you can, those sometimes can be a little bit tougher to measure. We've done some of this, and you can tell that when you look at the natural ecosystem, things are in pretty solid balance, but you're not producing a crop. So that area is very, very small. When you go to a number of our agricultural systems, and mainly conventional systems, our crop production is high because we've been pushing that for years, but the other petals are fairly low. And so what we want is something where you restore the ecosystem services, but you still can produce crops. And so the goal is not just yield. Then there's talk about, well, what about research approaches? There are so many words out there, and so I think these are really the key words. There are studies that are what we call disciplinary studies, and I'll give you some examples of each of these. A disciplinary study would be a single discipline looking at, for example, if, in that first study I did, looking at soil quality, we were all soil scientists. That's a disciplinary study. A multidisciplinary study would be, oh, you have at least two disciplines, so it could be soil scientists with economists, but you don't really have the same goals for the research. Each discipline has its particular goal, and for the economist it might be the cost and returns, for the soil scientist, soil quality, so there's not a lot of crossover. Where you get crossover is where you go to interdisciplinary, which is the third grouping, and that's really where you have true crossover between the disciplines, and you don't have separate goals. You have really one goal, and that's a little bit harder to do. Those three really entail scientists doing the research. Then there's this term called transdisciplinary, and it gets a little bit more complicated. It's really just interdisciplinary research, but now you use not just academics but non-academics. So you can have the general public, you can have farmers involved, and so it basically goes across academia and non-academia. And if you want to read a great paper on those four, Tress in Landscape et al. In Landscape Ecology discusses how we misinterpret those types of studies and the terminology, and it's discussed very well. And then you hear this popular term called holism, which Alan Savory used in 1988, and I don't know if scientists truly can do holistic research, because to do holistic research you have to be, I think, living in the system. So you'd have to almost be the farmer. The farmer can do holistic research because they're living in the system, looking outward rather than looking inward. So I guess if you were a researcher and you bought a farm, but you didn't have any outside income and you had to survive on that farm, maybe you would be doing holistic research. So I'm going to concentrate on the kinds of farming system studies, and I'm going to be talking about comparing organic systems with conventional systems, but these kinds of studies work for all systems, and I've actually looked at other systems too. If you wanted to throw no-till in there, or if you want to throw a mixed crop livestock system, and you certainly can put that in the mix, but I'm just going to be talking about organic and conventional. So I sort of break it into two groupings. You can use farms as replicates, which is probably more difficult, but it's also more fun, and probably the better word is more adventuresome, because you're dealing with a lot of farmers. Or you can use replicates on a farm. It can be an experimental farm, or it could actually be a farmer's farm. And so I'm going to talk about some of the studies that I've done and some of the data that my research teams have measured, and then I'm going to show you a couple of the real long-term studies that have been done that I've appreciated over the years. Recently I published a study with a number of scientists, and this was a strawberry study where we had 26 farms. That's a lot of farms. So we had 13 organic and 13 conventional. And on the surface, that sounds pretty easy to do. It pretty much almost terminated my life doing this study. So this was over 2 years, and these are where the farms are located. If you're talking about strawberries, I'm from Washington State, but you have to go to California. They grow about 90% of all the berries in the United States, all the strawberries. They grow about 25% of the strawberries globally. They're the big producers, and the Watsonville area probably grows about 40–50%. So Watsonville's in Santa Cruz County, and south of Watsonville would be Monterey County, where you'd have Salinas, and so that whole area is just a big strawberry producing area. So to do this study, we went down there, and we did that because we needed side-by-side farms. So this obviously is not a strawberry farm. But I'm showing this because it illustrates it very well. These are actually pasture farms in New Zealand. The one on the left is organic. The one on the right is conventional. And if you look at it, you think, well, I'm just going to go out there and I can sample this soil. These two farms can be in my study. But if you look more closely, we're now getting into Soils 101. You'll notice that, oh, wait a minute, there's the fence boundary, but the soil on the left it has all those A designations. That's that nice surface topsoil. It has basically no clay subsoil, B horizon, BT horizon. It just goes AC, whereas the one on the right does have that clay subsoil, which means the rooting depths are different, which means yields are going to be different, which means the whole regimen is going to be different. So when you come across this, you have to say to the farmer, I'm really sorry, I cannot use you in my study. And I have done this so many times, and so it's not just looking at the surface. You have to really go down 40–50 inches and make sure the soils are matched appropriately when you do these on-farm studies where you're using farms as replicates. This is what we did for the Palouse study, where we had to make sure the soils were the same. And even though the organic farmer had about a 1,000-acre farm and was surrounded by 4 conventional farmers, there was only one part of the farm one area with one conventional farmer that we could match the soils because the area is so diverse. Back to the strawberry study. Just to give you some examples, so here we had 13 matched pairs of organic and conventional farms. We had to ensure that the soils were similar. There were times that we could do that. Everything looked good, and then you start talking to the farmers, and the two farmers are growing different varieties of strawberries, which means you can't do this study there. So we would have to, move on to a new area. So here we looked at 3 cultivars, 3 varieties, but in each of the 13 pairs, the varieties were always the same. It has to be same. Everything has to be the same except for management. And in this study, the Palouse study, just back up for a second, that would be considered a disciplinary study because we were just looking at soils. This study would really be, I guess I would have to call it, it's almost it's actually an interdisciplinary study because there were 9 of us on this project. We had people in food science, we had plant science people, soil science, statisticians, and we also had a specialist in sensory evaluations. And we also had microbiologists to look at the DNA. So it was really an interdisciplinary study, and we had one goal in mind. And here we sampled strawberries over 2 years, and strawberries are kind of an interesting crop because in California they plant the berries in November, the seedlings, and the berries are producing in March, so they grow over winter, and by March they're producing, and so the pickers go out and start picking berries, and they will pick berries from the same field every 3 to 5 days for 7 months straight. It's high production, and they pick them on these beds. And so with strawberries, they go through, you learn a lot when you do these studies, they go through kind of different cycles, and meaning that yields can be possibly a little bit lower in the fall, higher in the summer, maybe low in early fall, and then, or excuse me, low in the spring, and then high in the summer, and then low in early fall, but then high maybe end of fall, and you have to take all those cycles into account. Organic berries may go through a different cycle than conventional berries. You don't know, so we cycled all 3 seasons over 2 years. We cycled in each of those 3 seasons. And we looked at a number of things. We looked at, we were really wanting to look at, there's this assumption that healthier soils produce healthier berries, and the 3 reasons, the 3 big reasons why people buy organic food is they think it's healthier, they think it tastes better, and they think it's more environmentally sound. And so we keyed in on the soil health for the environmentally sound, and for the strawberry health we keyed in on the nutrition because the jury is still a little bit out on that. As far as the residues go, the jury isn't out on that. There's enough studies that have been done that show that conventionally produced foods have a lot more residues than the organic foods. In fact, in some cases, the organic foods don't have any. And then we also wanted to do taste tests, which means you have to have a tasting lab, and you actually have to find people that know what strawberries are. And then in that case, it wasn't too hard. Strawberries are pretty well known. And here we looked also at soil quality, so we looked at traditional physical, chemical, and biological properties. We looked at about 31 of them. And then I had a grad student, in fact she's here, Jennifer Reeve, and she wanted to look at the DNA, and so she went to Oak Ridge National Lab to do that. And that was a very tedious process. I think what we thought was going to take 2 months took 6 months, but it worked out really well. And so we actually could look at the DNA and look at the gene sequences and the organisms that come from those gene sequences. And it's just another way of looking at soil quality. And so this study spans multiple levels, from genes to the strawberry system itself, all the way up to the consumer with the taste test. And just in general, what we found is that we had, the organic farms had greater soil microbial functional potentials and diversity, and improved soil health. There were, of the 31 parameters, 15 were statistically significant, favoring the organic, and none were statistically significant, favoring the conventional. The strawberries were of higher quality, higher antioxidants, higher vitamin C for the organic, and with one variety, one of the 3 varieties tasted better and aesthetically looked better to the, these were blind sensory panels that did the tasting. The organic berries also had more dry weight, which means there was more berry in the berry. So if you bought a clamshell, 1 pound clamshell of organic berries, you would be getting about 10%, 11% more strawberry. This study, I'll just mention quickly, this would be a multidisciplinary study because we were looking at economics and we were also looking at soil quality. This was in New Zealand. I did a sabbatical down there for a year. And I say multidisciplinary because the boundaries were real clear. The economist was looking at certain things, profits and cost, and the soil scientists were looking at specific things. We didn't really have a common goal in doing this. And here I'm throwing biodynamic in with organic. Biodynamic farmers are basically a little bit stricter with their certification guidelines because they have to have animals on the farm, and they had a series of 8 preparations. But basically, a lot of the other practices are the same. And here we had the uniqueness about this study is we had 11 pairs of biodynamic and conventional fields. But it wasn't just, for example, strawberries. It crossed over a lot of different cropping systems. And so we not only had vegetables and apples and citrus, we had dairy, we had grain systems, we had mixed crop livestock systems. But within a pair, they were always in the same enterprise. The soils always matched. And if it was, say, an orchard crop, the varieties were always the same. And here we found that the biodynamic farms had higher soil, biological, and physical quality. The chemical properties we looked at, and again we looked at probably about 25 different properties. The chemical properties, some favored the organic, some favored the biodynamic, and some favored the conventional. And when we looked at the economics, the biodynamic farms were as often financially viable, meaning in profit they were just as profitable as the conventional farms, and they were probably getting about 20% premium on the average at that time. All right, so that kind of covers farms, using farms as replicates. Now replicates on a farm, and more studies by far fit this category, and we've done this too. And a good example, just to show you, this is a wine grape study where we were actually comparing biodynamic with control or organic. But it shows you, this was about a 450-acre farm in Mendocino County, and about almost 200 acres were under wine grape production. And we were allowed to use 12 acres. And so I had to go out there and find a 12-acre block with basically similar soil. And so if you look at the diagram on the left, yes, that really is sheep in the vineyard after the grapes have been harvested, of course. But they do put sheep out there to help control weeds, and all for nutrient cycling too. But this basically would be kind of a traditional replicated plot study, but on the farm, and where we're working with the farmer, the consultants, the growers right there. And so this particular project would actually be transdisciplinary because we're actually helping make decisions together. Kathy mentioned the apple study, and that's probably the best example that I've done of transdisciplinary research. Here, this particular study, this was in Yakima Valley of Washington State. Apples are our biggest income crop. We grow, I think, well, we certainly grow over 50% of all the apples in the U.S., and I think the latest ag census, I think it was at 58%. And so we had to make sure, I had a farmer who was very interested, had a 50-acre apple cherry farm. We also grow good cherries in Washington State. And he was very interested, he and his brother were interested in possibly converting to organic, but wasn't really sure. And also we talked about, well, gee, maybe there's middle ground, an integrated system. And he said, well, I have 4 acres. We could, I'm going to be planting it to apples, come out and check the ground, see if we can set up some plots. And so we did. And so we had basically 4 organic plots. They were each 1/3 of an acre in size, each having 300, actually be 301 trees per plot. So these are dwarf trees. They're planted almost like wine grapes. And we had an integrated treatment. It's not IPM. IPM is kind of just going part way. IPM is for pest management, which is very good. Organic farmers use IPM. Integrated farmers use IPM. Integrated farming systems, you have to build the soil. You have to add organic matter to the soil. So you really balance the two production systems of organic and conventional. And then we had conventional systems too. And that was it was managed by the growers, by the scientists, and also the consultants, because we had consultants coming in checking for pests. And so we were always meeting, and that's where you get that transdisciplinary approach, because it was at academic and non-academic levels, and we were making decisions throughout the study. And so we actually ran the study for almost 10 years, and I'm going to just show you some of the results of the first 6 years. And we were a little bit bolder on this one. We looked at a number of sustainability indicators, horticultural performance, yield, tree diameter. We did taste tests. We also looked at fruit quality, storage potential, because a lot of the apples are stored. They can be stored actually for up to 18 months. They like to store them only for 6 to 9 months, but they can store them longer. And if they don't meet a certain firmness test in Washington State, when they're pulled out of storage, they're cold and they're used for applesauce and apple juice, which is good, but it's not economically good for the grower. You lose money. We looked at profitability. We kept track of all costs for each of the blocks. We did the same thing with energy. And we also did the same thing with all the chemicals, all the pesticides applied on organic, integrated, and conventional. And we did the same thing with all the energy used on all three systems. So this was a big study. Jerry Glover was the grad student on the project at the time, and so I owe a lot to Jerry. And here we had a lot of conclusions. These are most of them. So yields and tree growth were similar, but the organic fruit was smaller. So yields were about the same. That was a pretty interesting finding. Last couple of years, the fruit from the organic system was smaller, which is kind of normal, but it also means that the apples bring in a little bit less money. You get less money for smaller apples. The organic fruit, though, was sweeter. These were golden delicious. That was a plus, and they were also as firm, if not firmer. That's a plus. Less were cold. The organic system was the most profitable. Had to go through a 3-year transition, so we didn't get that. We didn't get basically the premium those first 3 years, but the next 3 years we did, and that premium averaged about 50%. But so when people say, well, it was more profitable because of the premium, that's only half the story. It was more profitable because it had good yields and it got the premium. So you have to keep those two in mind. The organic and integrated systems had better soil quality. Both added compost. The integrated system added half as much compost as the organic system, and both had potentially lower negative environmental impact from pesticides. We used a pesticide impact rating system. And the organic system was the most energy efficient. The integrated was second, and the conventional was third. So when you put all those variables together, you can then make some statements about environmental and economic sustainability. You really can't say overall sustainability because we haven't looked at the social dimension. But the organic system did rank first in environmental and economic sustainability. The integrated was second, and the conventional was third. Now, I want to mention a couple other studies and there have been a number of others, and I just chose these. This is one of the best studies I've seen. This was done in 1995 by a group, Smolik and Dobbs from South Dakota State, and some others did this 7-year study with both small and large grain systems, and this kind of summarizes the two grain systems. It ran for 7 years. It was basically done replicates on a farm, not farms as replicates. And they looked at a number of things. They looked at energy use, soil erosion potential, pollution potential, subsidy dependence, that's a big one economically, environmental stress, yields per acre, and profitability. And they looked at organic, conventional, and basically reduced tillage. And if you look at that, organic systems do very well energy-wise, and in this study it did well. The erosion potential was lowest for the organic, and of course the minimum till. Pollution potential was the lowest for the organic, and subsidy dependence was lowest for the organic. Environmental stress was, the organic systems were more stable. Yields per acre, I think it was in the small grain study, the organic was right there with the other systems, but in the large grain, it was 3/4 of the yield. And profitability, the organic was able to make more money. And this, as I said, this study was in 1995, and it's a very tight system study. And then, of course, there's two other big studies I just want to mention, and you'll probably hear about these this afternoon. The Rodale Farming Systems trial, which started in 1981, so this is its 30th year. Just the fact that we have that. We have large-sized plots where you can use equipment on them. And they're looking at 3 systems, two different organic systems and a conventional system. And their results so far basically shown that the organically managed soils can sequester more carbon. The quality of the soil is better. You know, you hear that a lot about quality of soils on organic systems being better. All you have to do is go to any introductory soil science textbook. They have a whole chapter usually on organic matter and all the benefits organic matter contribute to the soil. So if you add organic matter, you're going to usually produce a better soil. And similar rates of nitrate leaching, energy use is lower on the organic, and greater biodiversity. And then there are a number of other things. I'm just going to mention at the very bottom, one of the big conclusions that they use is they don't say, well, everybody should be organic. They just say, hey, some of these practices that we're finding that are beneficial, we should use some of those practices. They should be used on conventional systems. You don't have to convert. Use our rotations. You know, use legumes in your rotation. You don't have to convert all the way. Be an integrated farmer. And I think that's kind of neat. And then the longest term study that I know of is in Switzerland. I know that the talk is really U.S., but I had to mention this, and that's the DOC trials where they actually look at biodynamic, organic, integrated, and conventional. And they've had multiple publications over the last 20 years from their studies. The big one was Mader et al. In Science, and I highly recommend looking at that. And then just my final slide, you might have noticed I didn't really say much about the social aspects. I haven't really done that. It can be done. I'm more of a natural scientist, so it's difficult for me, but I certainly, I'm looking at doing a study where I'll have a social scientist on my team to do that. And if you look at all the literature, the comparison studies, the environmental aspects dominated the sustainability. When you look at the 3 legs, environmental, economic, and social sustainability, the environmental dominates as far as numbers of studies. The economic studies would be second. And then coming in way last would be the social, and they're hard to do. You can do surveys, and we need more of that, and we're actually starting to get more of that. So I really would, it's great to see this expansion of social studies, but it's something we really need. And we're talking about, you know, wages for workers, benefits, is it good for community well-being, things that you have to, some of it you can get hard data on, some you have to go to surveys to do. And there's actually a keynote talk tomorrow morning on social dimensions of sustainability. I think it's at 8:45 or 8:30. Thank you very much.